to create a checklist as anything.
Video last year of someone, a lecturer who got caught in an elevator and trying to give his lecture. So, it's quite funny. And I don't think he had a sound on.
Oh yeah, so yeah, this is the thing I keep worrying about. I keep checking, like, actually, is that microphone actually recording anything? Because I've got, you can find recordings of me giving lectures online without any sound, and little comments underneath saying there's no sound.
I did an open day on Thursday with no sound. Just took my slides, never seen them before.
And just did it. Oh, that karaoke slides, that's the best. Okay, so last time we actually sort of failed to get on to the subject of the lecture. So oddly, we're a bit behind, but that's fine because expected this might happen. So the lecture titles might change and update at some point, but for the moment, this is the bit I wanted to get onto, which is these three challenges were things that I was giving a talk for Data Science Africa, a workshop in Uganda, I think in about 2016. And they asked me to give a talk about data science in general. And I thought I should talk about the challenges of data science. And I ended up writing these three things down. And I realized afterwards that actually I realized actually in preparing these lectures that it's the broad area of what I, and not just me, lots of people with me, research at the moment. So I want to go through what they are. And the three of them are what I think of as the paradoxes of the data society, quantifying the value of data, and privacy, loss of control, and marginalization. There might be more challenges than that, but it turns out people remember things in threes. So even if there isn't three of something, you should always say there's three of something. So the first one is the paradox of data society. This is a weird one. So I call this the big data paradox. We're collecting more and more data, but we're understanding less and less about society as a whole, which is quite a funny thing. So when I first was noticing this in preparation for this lecture, I didn't actually have a really good explanation. I think I've got a better explanation about what's going on now. But to give you a sort of the context of what I mean, sometimes people have this expression, there's an expression in English, you can't see the woods for the trees. This is actually a forest in Denmark somewhere, I found a picture of. So what do we mean by can't see the woods for the trees? We're ending up so much focused on the things that are in front of us, the details of them, that we don't see the broader context. Now, what classical statistics is really good at is allowing us to see the woods, because what it says is what you do in order to understand the woods, you take a randomized sample of the forest that is collected in clever ways to make sure it's representative of what the forest looks like. And then you start looking at aggregates in that randomized sample. So that's really powerful because it allows you to understand the population of the trees as a whole. But very often today, we might like to understand something a bit more about the structure of that forest. So this little clearing here, we might want to understand the way the light is falling on the floor. I heard, so this is a very cool thing about Cambridge. So James Jackson, who's in my college, he's a geologist. I was asking him about the local geology and the interface between, we're on a border between the Cretaceous and like Jurassic clay. And that means that in Cambridge, you have these alkali soils mapping up to acid soils. He was telling me this. And it means you've got these ecosystems of orchids around Cambridge, like just outside Fulbourn, that grow nowhere else in the world. Like these very small ecosystems, because you get this weird sort of interface of the well-draining chalk and then mapping onto the sort of the more acidic clays that come from behind. And that sort of structure is really cool, right? That's almost like the things that you care about. So if you were to do a sort of vast sort of, survey of the hills, the Gog Magog hills and everything, you wouldn't find any of this. The other thing he told me is there's a beech wood at the top of Gog Magog that must be really old because there's a type of flower growing there that grows only on a fungus that grows on beech trees that are over 100 years old. And so, I mean, just wild, right? So apparently all this stuff comes from a botanist called, I think it's Oliver Rackman, who was at Christ and died about 8 years ago. Very cool. So that type of structure is the sort of thing we want to worry about. I look at Oliver Rackman going around the countryside, finding out all this information, yet we don't seem capable of getting it because we either do one of two things. We look at the wood or the tree. So what tends to happen is we acquire data about one aspect. So the big data paradox is this emergent phenomena where someone's collected so much data about an entity, like a particular tree, and how a caterpillar is moving on that tree, and all this sort of information about that. But it's actually utterly irrelevant to the question you have at hand. And what happens is, because of your limited bandwidth to absorb all this information, you get overwhelmed with the richness and diversity of this data that they've collected, but you're not actually capable of understanding it's nothing to do with what I care about. It's nothing to do with this scale of the system, this thing between the forest and the tree, the clearing, the sort of area where these plants are growing off the roots of the trees. And this is a massive problem in today's society, because what everyone's doing is, I've got all this data, so we'll be able to solve the problem. But when you think about the complexity of the world relative to the data you can collect, the world is well ahead of you. So you enter this weird zone where you've collected a lot of data, and so you think you've got a really accurate representation of the world, but you're nowhere near the richness and complexity and diversity of the real world around us, but you're well beyond a human's ability to conceive of the data. Yeah? And I think that's what really drives this thing that we see it constantly in society. You can also think about it in another way, in a conceptual way, in terms of the way we collect data. So what you tend to find is what I think of as the breadth or the depth paradox. So it turns out, like, if you look at classical statistics, what that tries to do is collect a few features from very many subjects. So if we want to do a forest survey, we go out into the woods and we find every animal that we can, and maybe we get 10 animals, and we find out 3 things about them, like, do they have feathers? You know, how many legs do they have? 3 features like this. And then we try and use those features to make some sort of prediction. We do it in a randomized way to answer some question. And we've got 100 animals and 3 features. And then that's called, like, so we've got n samples and 3 features. And now we can fit statistical models and try and say things about that data. There's a sort of a slightly odd thing that happens. Imagine we've got a really diligent botanist who, after they've found these 10 things, they go back in these, 3 features. They go back into the forest and they come back and say, you won't believe what I've done. I've taken those 100 animals and I've found 997 more things about them. So now we have 100 animals and 1,000 features, right? Now this is apparently a problem, because now we have what's called a large p small n problem. We've got more features than we have data. And you may know from your previous teaching that this means that your model is well determined. And everyone says, oh, this is such a terrible thing, you know. But this doesn't make any sense, does it? Because the person's collected more data. So we've got more information, but somehow we're in this new bad position, which is called large p small n. And what it's really about is the way we've chosen to define our models. And we tend to define our models with conditional independence, right? You'll have studied that in other subjects, that we say, given this parameter set, these data are conditionally independent. And so we have p parameters and n observations, and those p parameters become badly defined. And so then we can't fit our statistical model, that the models tend to overfit. But it's a consequence of the models that we're used to using, not a consequence of the real world. In the real world, we've clearly got more information about these animals, and we should be able to make better decisions. So it's something to do with the tools we have, not to do with the data itself. But people talk about it as a problem with the data. And of course, all that's coming from this history of this is what we can do well. This history is we do these samples, these randomized controlled trials, we run it in this way, and we develop methods that are targeted towards that. But we're now in this world where we've got all these diverse ways of getting data. A really good book, if you're interested in more of this, is that book I've probably mentioned before that I should have a slide on, Matthew Salaganick's Bit by Bit, where he talks about social science and the effect on social science of these modern data challenges. So that's the sort of, why is that moving forward? Try again. So we're able to quantify to a greater and greater degree the actions of, say, individuals, but we're somehow less able to characterize the society about them. So it's a really weird paradox that we measure more, but we seem to understand less. And so you say, well, what? How could that be? Well, there's another sort of performative aspect. The greater preponderance of data could in itself be making society more complex. So that's another possible explanation for what's going on. So as we release, if we have a more digitized society, you know, an example would be polls trying to predict elections, right? we've struggled to predict, say, the US election or the European referendum in the UK. And one of the things that's going on there is that you have these approaches to polling that are not randomized controlled trials. You do things like you say, it's too expensive to go and ask, what to properly do it, right? You'd have to randomly pick people from across the country. What's your directory for doing that? You have to find some directory. Then you have to find those people and you have to like extract out of them what their voting preference is, right? And some people don't want to say what their voting preference is, or may be difficult to find, etc. So what, of course, people do in practice, historically, people would use fixed phone lines to telephone people. But then, of course, everyone stops using fixed phone lines. So then you want to use mobile phones, but but the representation of mobile phones in the elderly versus the young, you get all these sort of problems that will come up, and you'll see in the Simpsons paradox example that you're starting to stratify your population in odd ways through the use of technology. And then you're polling them through that use of technology, and you're getting a misrepresentative sample of what's going on. So we seem less able to sort of do a poll today than we were years ago. The way that statisticians deal with that is reweighting of these samples to try and rebalance according to population. But those sample weights are often calibrated on the previous election. So if your society is changing quickly enough, those sample weights will be out of date. And so we see that type of effect happening a lot. So I sometimes, this whole aspect of like, you're measuring a lot of it, but you're not measuring it in a uniformly distributed way, is I think of it as like a curate's egg of society. It's only measured it in parts. And almost this notion of measuring only parts is somehow potentially worse than measuring less, but measuring the whole thing, right? So it's sort of difference between this sort of the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, right? So I think there's some sort of concept there that's like, which would you rather have, the whole truth or nothing but the truth, or some sort of like partial truths that are not representative of the whole truth, right? That could be quite confusing. And that's the sort of thing that's going on at the moment. So I've sort of said that. So they are given these examples. Another one would be clinical trials. So one of the things we're able to do now with biological data is quantify the individual much better and understand their response to a drug. But this is causing problems because it's allowing us to stratify the population, and then it's hard to get the statistical power to validate the drug, right? So if you do a large-scale drugs trial, such as the vaccines drugs trial, you're giving the vaccine to whatever it was, 60,000 people, and you wait till a certain number of them become ill, and then you've done it across the population. What did the AstraZeneca vaccine get criticized for? For not dosing more elderly people. And then you had this whole totally incorrect thing from politicians saying it was quasi-ineffective in the elderly because it didn't dose elderly people. So it missed that strata. It turned out that's not true. But of course, if you want to draw a conclusion about the whole population, genuinely, you should sample from the whole population. But now, as we're trying to focus medicines on particular sections of the population, which we can quantify by looking at their genomics or some other way of measuring their profile, you have less and less data to get statistical power. So that's presenting a problem as well, right? So drugs are becoming more and more expensive as they become more personalized because they're much harder to validate statistically. Okay, so I don't know, what about the solutions? Well, for me, this is one of those sort of things, is that the notion is that somehow the era of data science means statistics matters less. Well, as you already heard me to say, no, it matters even more. And you as computer scientists, if you want to become data scientists, will need to know more about classical statistics and how to deploy those methods. And I'm always reminded like of the paperless office. So the paperless office was this notion in Xerox in the sort of 1970s when they were sort of saying, well, in the future, people won't use paper because they'll just have computers. And so they started working on the GUI and things like that. Why was Xerox worried about that? Because Xerox was making photocopies. Yeah, I mean, in the United States, people used to use it as a verb to Xerox something. Well, ironically, Canon ended up dominating the photocopier market, which grew way. I mean, of course, now it's less. It came true in the end, but the actual response was by the 1990s, we were cutting down more and more trees to make more and more paper than ever before, because just the availability of computers meant that we were printing more information. So, and we didn't have iPads or anything like that. I mean, and even today we've got iPads. Many of you are preferring to use paper. and make notes on things. So actually the demand for paper went up. And I sort of see there's a weird parallel between that and people saying things about classical statistics. Because we're processing more and more information, the need for those classical techniques and understanding of it is getting greater and greater. And they used to be this sort of preserve of the graduate statistician, but now we need to understand them as well. So other things like larger studies, so the 100,000 genome and UK Biobank project. These are projects where you're getting biological samples from across the country. I think it's up to, sorry, when I made this slide 4 years ago, it's probably 100,000 now, it's like a million genome, trying to characterize more the population, increasing N. Increase P and increase N together so that you're getting more and more information about society. Okay, now in this one made me realize that this is coming out of the pandemic. There's something really weird going on with modeling. And I realized that there's a sister to the big data paradox, which is the big model paradox, which is if you want to make decisions on the basis of data, if you build a model that is so complicated that you cannot communicate what your model is doing to policymakers and domain experts, this is very problematic, because you as sort of technical people can put all these aspects into your model and say, well, it is accounting for this and it's not accounting for that. But if you then want a discussion about that model with a large number of other people that allows you to convene on a decision that you all feel vested in, if your model is beyond someone else's understanding, you cannot have that discussion. I mean, it has this other side effect that if the model is too simple, this is another thing that Sir Kahneman talks about this, calls it theory-induced blindness. I call it model-induced blindness. If you describe too simple a model that people can understand, they start projecting that model on the world. They believe that is the way the world works, even though it obviously doesn't. And they ignore data in respect to that model. So there's a whole sort of weird thing going on in terms of modeling. But either you make your model too complicated, in which case no one can understand it, and you can't convene the diverse group of experts you really want to point out things like, your ad blocker is blocking your slides, or, maybe this is the reason why AI isn't coming up high enough, and all these other things. That's why you want this diversity of opinion. If you can't present your model and your data in such a way that the people can understand that, you won't get that conversation and you'll make serious errors. Right? And we definitely have seen this all over scientific advice in the pandemic. You could talk about whatever you like about the politicians. I think the scientists have not done a good job in terms of getting themselves in a position where they're discussing amongst a diverse group of people what the right conclusion is before it goes to the politicians, like turning up the politicians with very, very complicated models. It's impossible for politicians to decide. Okay, so that's the paradoxes of data society. The next challenge I want to talk about, and you see this pervasive, this is everywhere, it'll be the bane of your life, is that we don't quantify the value of the data well. So in terms of the work that we need to do, so there's a sort of sea of data, but it's mostly undrinkable. So we require data desalination before it's consumed. I probably already said you've got this phenomenon whereby all companies have been told to put their data in their centralized data lake. But because they didn't look at what they were putting in, it is a data swamp, or we can think of it as a data salt marsh. Some sort of area where what you've put into that thing, maybe it's consumable in parts, but it's no good to be consumable in parts, because actually we need to guarantee it needs to be a clean water drinking reservoir if we're going to make use of efficiently of that data to do data decision making. And why is that? Well, because people don't care about the hard work and labor of cleaning up data. This was just from a workshop at NeurIPS on medical data, where I was giving a talk about this. And so I just took quotes from what people had said in previous talks. 90% of our time is spent on validation integration. That's the person who gave it this talk, this workshop. The dirty work we don't want to think about, that's Eric Jing. Voodoo to get it decompressed. In healthcare, this is another aspect. Clinicians collect the data and often control the direction of research through guardianship of the data. So you'll see that very, very commonly. And you also have to understand why they're doing it. So clinicians put an enormous amount of work into collecting data and of patients who give their data willingly to help people with disease. And then if you come along as a data scientist, there was a term for it that was in the Lancet, data that was, I can't remember the term they used. There was an article in the Lancet where people were complaining about this, sort of the data scientists coming along and using my carefully collected data to solve the disease without crediting me. Now, okay, so there's some weird things going on here, right? Like, does the doctor actually care more about solving the disease or getting the credit? Well, so we might say, well, the doctor shouldn't care, but the doctor's a human being, right? And if you don't propagate the credit back to the person who collected the data, and if they have mechanisms for controlling that data, which they do, which are ethics mechanisms, that data tends to get locked down. And so there's an incentive actually for clinicians, and not all clinicians are doing this, to lock down their data and not make it available, because the people who do the downstream analysis don't credit them properly with the hard work of collecting that data, curating that data, and cleaning it up. The real problem here is that, you know, data cleaning is difficult work, but it's tedious work. To do data cleaning well, you have to have domain expertise, right? You have to understand the problem and what decisions you can and can't make, and some technical expertise. But it's one of the most boring things you might ever do, unless you can invent little games to make it more interesting for yourself. So no one wants to do that work. You have to be skilled, but at the same time, I mean, the one reason, what's the whole AI revolution based on, by the way? It's based on getting vast realms of people to label data. Now, the type of data they're labeling is things like for language or object detection. So all humans are somewhat expert in that, right? So we can just employ students to label data, or we can employ people in countries where the cost of labor is lower and do it by Mechanical Turk, right? But when it comes to expert data, which requires experts, particularly medical data, that's quite problematic to do that. So we need to work out ways of trying to incentivize people to share that production, right? And you'll see that's not going on in practice. It's quite a big problem. So you need to quantify the value of the contribution of each actor. And why is this a problem? Well, I'll go to, I don't know if you've studied any reinforcement learning, but in reinforcement learning, what goes on is that there's the state of the world, there's an action you can take, and then a policy, and then you get a reward for doing that. And over time at each step, so this is for things like AlphaGo, the state of the world is the board, you work out some reward mechanism for rewarding the move. And in AlphaGo's case, that they've got a neural networks for a lot of these things and a policy for which move to make. And you do learning in this system, right? Why this is hard, because the winning move at the end of the game here, which is the thing you care about, you need to try and understand how early moves affected this. That's known as the credit assignment problem. And it's known to be NP hard, right? So knowing like what we're doing today, right, in this lecture, as I try and teach you this stuff, how does that affect the global economy in 10 years' time, right? Well, you may do amazing things, you know, people, your predecessors include people like Demis Hassabis, right? So that affects the world economy. How do we credit his education in the computer lab for that? Well, it's really hard, right? It's really, really hard, because even if there was influence, there's a number of influences going on. So it's part of a spectrum of things. And if you're trying to sort of reward that education in some way, it becomes very, very, very difficult. And the same thing will apply to data, right? So how do you credit the work of people who are making sure those data lakes are data lakes, not data swamps, you know, at the beginning when they're putting the data in, and reward that work so that downstream, when you're solving cancer, you know, whatever else, you've got to work out reward mechanisms. And people aren't even aware of the problem. So there are a number of domains where we're aware of these problems, like in education and like infrastructure for roads and et cetera, right? We know that we should put money into that, even though the direct chain of value is hard to unpick. In data, people aren't even aware this is one of the biggest issues. So you as data scientists will find that you're faced with that issue all the time, that you're basically having to do those moves from the start to the end, which is why, you know, your assignment work is trying to focus on something that shows you that pipeline. Now, okay, there is one area where people are more aware of this, and that tends to be computational biology. And the reason is because in computational biology, these issues arose a lot earlier than in other domains, because they started doing the human genome, 20 years ago, we could start sequencing that, right? And then there's the sort of way in which data has become to dominate in that field has been about sort of I'd say 10 to 15 years ahead of the rest of society. So there's this wonderful place, Foggy Bottom, where the Wellcome Trust had a joint statement on data from 2010. And it's sort of so interesting if you want to see like someone else going down this path and learn like how they dealt with it. Then looking at the computational biology community is a really good route. By the way, that's also what draws the challenges for personalized health into such sharp relief, because you've got this interesting interface between biology and health, which is kind of this interface between the point at which the data becomes about humans and health. And of course, you go suddenly from, oh, loads of data is available, to data is not available at all. It's in very, very sharp relief, and for very good reasons, right? Amazing guy, Peter Diggle, who I've had the pleasure to work with on a couple of occasions. He's a sort of statistical epidemiologist, so studies the spread of disease, and they were trying to work on, I don't know, this was before COVID, they were looking at gastroenteritis, so stomach diseases, that was seen as something, and they weren't getting a lot of funding, but the one thing where they could test the models was all vets will report on animal diseases that they're recording. So he could test his model across the country. He could get all the cat and dog diseases and how they were propagating and look at the epidemiology of those diseases, but getting epidemiology of human diseases is very, very difficult. Of course, how have we dealt with that? There's very cool things like the Zoe app, right? So Tim Spector developing the Zoe app. And one of the things Peter was doing in the pandemic was exactly this task of taking information from the Zoe app, which is very high resolution for certain sections of the population, recalibrating that information from the Zoe app using things like REACT, which is the nationwide surveillance study on the prevalence of COVID, linking across those data, reweighting the symptom information in the Zoe app to get a high resolution map across the country. So there you immediately see some of the solutions you can get. You've got REACT is the national surveillance study on COVID, where people are genuinely getting measured in a randomized way. If you can link that data to Zoe app information, which people are asked to provide their Zoe app information, which is much higher spatial resolution, but it's not randomly sampled and potentially suffers from these challenges of sampling the wrong thing in the forest, then you can get these high resolution maps. So that's the sort of thing that we can do. So that's a very positive outcome. Okay, so one of the things that I've tried to do on that is, one of the things I noticed in this space, and these levels are being used in various areas now, we started using them in Amazon, is data readiness levels, because I noticed there wasn't even a language to talk about this. So this paper is just about try and have a language to talk about this so that you can explain to your manager why employing some PhD machine learners at this stage of the project is wrong, right? Because you can say, well, we're only data readiness level C. So data readiness levels are sort of very broadly speaking are about, and they're going to map on to the data science process we're going to talk about. So very broadly speaking, 3 grades of data readiness. One is like the data isn't even accessible. So like we know the data exists, but it's not yet electronically available to us for some reason. That might be because it's distributed on people's mobile phones. That might be because it's written in handwritten logbooks. That might be because we haven't yet got the permissions to look at the data in the trusted research environment. So it's, we don't even see the data. Now, data transfers from C to B at the moment that you can load it into your machine. That might mean that you've got an API. That mean you've got a CSV file. All of a sudden you get access to that data. So data at C requires all these capabilities that are beyond us in this room. It requires things like legal expertise. It requires ethical advice. It requires some authorization from the ethics. It may require, working with, so there's an example we'll talk about where you have to work with a policeman who's got logbook records of traffic accidents across the town, and you need to photograph them, right? You may need to crowdsource the information to get access. All sorts of things going on at level C that will just vary vastly from one task to another. You're not doing much stuff at level C in this course because that would be like, oh no, maybe we should. Then we could like have a field trip somewhere, couldn't we? We could go somewhere really cool and have a field trip. Well, we're just doing data readiness at level C here in Acapulco. That's the beauty of data. You've got an excuse to go anywhere. So B is this validity. So the transition from I've now got this data and I want to clean this up. Now, the key thing about B is it's this transition to pose a question to the data. So actually, I probably should update that slide. I don't even think that anymore. What I think the transition from B to A is, data goes from B to A. Well, everything you do in B is the things you can do to data before you know the question, right? So there's a bunch of stuff. And to me, this is like, so what you'll hear a lot is data science being split into data wrangling, followed by modeling, right? For me, the modeling is mainly occurring here. There's some stuff you can do with modeling at B. But there's a lot of classical, what you get taught in data science is this final step where you've got a question you want to answer from the data. What's the prediction you want to make? What is the conclusion you're trying to draw from the data? That's level A. B is this squeezed level. So people kind of end up doing this, right, just by life. But what happens is this level B, what I want B to be is reusable, right? So there's cleanup work that you do on data sets that is not specific to the question you're trying to answer, that other people could use. And the point is, now you're doing reusable work. What is the whole, like, there was this thing called the software crisis back in the day. People heard of the software crisis? These wonderful quotes about the software crisis that was of the form, you know, when machines were large and difficult to use, no one was writing any software, so we had no problem with software. As soon as machines became available widely in the sort of late 70s and 80s, software systems became a mess because everyone was sitting there writing their own software and no one else was able to understand what that software was doing. So the answer to the software crisis was we had to work out ways of writing reusable software. And, you know, 20 years ago, everyone was going on about object-oriented programming the whole time because that was like one of the main paradigms for how we reuse software. But actually, if you just look across a lot of software engineering today, you'll see there's a lot of paradigms for working out how we make use of and construct and reuse software. Most of it, so there's this book called the Mythical Man Month, which is about the fact that if you add resource, if you add people to working on software, the project slows up because a lot of the challenge is the communication overhead. So what you tend to see is software companies today structure their organization to map onto their software. So in Amazon, you had teams of about 6 to 12 people, and each of them owned a software component, a service that was managed by that team. And it's all about sort of reusability and usability of software. We don't have the same culture around data. Remember the data as debugging analogy. We've got data on this USB stick. Then you do all that work to tidy up that data on the USB stick. How is that work made reusable? Yeah, how do we get that work that was done on this data set now so that someone else can see what you did, reconstruct it, find out where there were any misunderstandings, and adapt it if necessary? So we're in this data crisis that is equivalent to the software crisis right now. And I think that this grade B is kind of where all the work should be being done. So we'll talk about that a bit more when we talk about the data science process that I'm proposing you use for your project. Oh, by the way, who's doing a data science project? I'm doing a data science project for their part 2. Anyone here? Yeah. So I'm hopeful. If you look at the pink book, you will see nothing in the pink book that is describing what you will need to do if you're doing a data science project in terms of describing your processes, right? It says, do the software requirements, write up this, what was the process you used? Part of my idea here is if you are doing a data science project, you can lift things from this and use that as part of your processes as you feel appropriate to describe how you're approaching the problem, because it gives you a framework. What this is a mess, right? And what you're doing is a mess that you're having to solve on your own. And then you have to write it up and explain how it was all structured and it was great and it wasn't ever really a mess. I mean, all software projects are a bit like that, and that's the process you're going through. So what you will be able to do, if you like, don't have to, is steal liberally from this process and say, I was using this process and that, you know, and I use this aspect to do this, to just explain what you were going on. And you will find if you do that, I hope, if this works, that helps structure your thinking about as you're doing your project. So that's kind of one goal of what we're saying here. So yeah, I've sort of already said this stuff. So I like to use this term hearsay data for data when someone says, because that's how I came up with the data readiness level grades, because I was sitting in a meeting with someone who was, I think they were at Coventry University, and they had this set of houses which were instrumented with sort of sheltered accommodation with vulnerable people living in them that they were instrumenting for telehealthcare. And they wanted to work with us on machine learning for, you know, identifying when is a very interesting and potentially useful application. And and at some point, the individual, nothing against this individual, these things come up all the time. They said, oh, well, we got the data. And I thought, oh, yeah, I've heard that before. And I thought of, oh, so data at that stage is hearsay data, because they've heard they've got the data. So they say they've got the data, but they haven't actually looked themselves to see if they've got the data. And this is at the most extreme end, just like at the beginning of the lecture, I'm worried, oh, am I recording sound? Right? Unless you have a checklist when you are building, like my friends who did the podcast the other night, unless you have a checklist when you were building your data ecosystem, you may well find that the data you thought you were recording, you weren't recording. And very often it's only when the machine learning person comes along and says the equivalent of, I'd like to watch this video now, or I'd like to actually process this data, that you find out that the data wasn't being recorded. Or that there's some fundamental problem with the licensing of the data, that the permissions weren't correct in terms of the data they have acquired from people. You've seen this all over the place. People dumping sensors in urban environments to try and acquire data about how the population's using. This is personal data. You haven't got the permission of the people you're recording. How can you do anything on the back of this data? And that's kind of right. Otherwise, we'd be in a surveillance society. But people think about that too late. Right? That needs to be thought of at the beginning. So there are all these sort of challenges at grade C that you'll be aware of, that we won't cover in this course. Next year, when we do our field trip to Acapulco, we'll be doing a lot of that. The validity of the data, though, how faithful is this data to what it purports to be, right? So now someone said this data is supposed to be this. Is it really this? Well, there's a bunch of work you can do now to check, well, is this data, you don't know that this data can answer the question you want to solve, but you can check that is this data roughly in the right area. So is it faithful to and representing lots of visualizations here, looking at your data, plotting your data, always plot your data. First thing you do, get given data, plot it, plot it, plot it. Exploratory data analysis is a domain in statistics that is also describes the type of work that's gone on here. It's a name invented by Tukey to sort of differentiate between what he would call confirmatory data analysis, where you're confirming a question, versus when you're just looking at the data and trying to understand what might be in there. And things like characterizing noise or missing values or outliers. A is itself, so I'm going to speed through that, is the usability, like data in context. Now we're going to use it to answer a question. Now, most of the time across most courses in both statistics and machine learning, the techniques you're being taught are really only useful at grade A, right? And this is kind of a problem because everyone now tries to go in and resolve questions with grade A as if data is grade A without going through all the hard work of getting it to a stage where it's drinkable. So it's sort of like you end up drinking salt water, and actually if you do enough of that, you will be sick. And the same thing happens in data science in practice. Okay, so yeah, there's something about this. These are very recursive. So like you can think data's at one grade, then you can realize it isn't. I mean, they are sort of stages. There is an order to them naturally, but you end up having to do little subcalls to the process to like imagine that we realize that a data set is not useful until it's labeled in some way. Well, now you have to go through the acquisition of labels to get that data set useful, right? And so you end up sort of calling this. So different data sets end up requiring other data sets to come in. Where we found this quite useful and we wrote a report on it was in the pandemic, and there were data sets we wanted. We would write all the data sets down. We actually added a grade D. We don't even know if this data exists. So we had like 4 grades of data readiness. This is data we would like to exist, but we don't even know that it exists. C, we heard this data exists. That's grade C. B, we've got access electronically to this data. And A, we're actually doing things with this data. And the team actually we had Ulrich Paquet led a team out of DeepMind of software engineers. And I mean, Ulrich's just amazing. He's a data analysis, does lots of software engineering. And we put data online at grade, sort of transition to B to A, and made that available. And that team was doing that work. And we wrote a sort of report about the experiences we found with different data sets. Okay, so yeah, I think I've probably talked about that. Oh, and the other aspect to that, which then is if you were running a business, how ready are your people to process data? So when I say data readiness level, some people misinterpret that as what's the readiness of my organization. So also in that Delve report, we started talking about that, but I would call that a data maturity framework to try and distinguish it. I mean, you could see each term could be applied to the other. How data mature is a firm? How ready are people to access data? How possible is it within a company to develop, to move data across departments? This turns out to be almost impossible in most companies. So a data mature company would have that capability, but most companies are not data mature. So the final one I want to just mention, and then we'll come to the proposed solutions in the next lecture, is privacy, loss of control, and marginalization. This constant thing that we're now acquiring data from across society, we're acquiring it in a randomized way, and we're looking at aggregate statistics, has this ongoing effect that any marginalized group is going to be more marginalized by this process, because we're not stratifying into those subgroups. That's whether that's vulnerable people, so people who are ill, have some form of disability, children, the elderly, minorities, historically marginalized groups. It's going to happen across the board. So how do we deal with that? Well, one of the things that I find, and I wrote about this sort of, you could find, I've got a series of Guardian articles like from 2014, 15 that talk about this stuff, is we now have the capability to market towards people through advertising in such ways that it seems, certainly from the work, not the Cambridge analytical work, but the work that preceded that was done in Cambridge, can't remember the student's name now, he was a PhD student here, where they, it's a PNAS paper where basically the claim was that Facebook knows you better than your friends do. So, and the meaning of that was that by looking at your Facebook likes, they could characterize your personality through psychological testing in such a way where they could predict your preferences through a very simple, I think it was a lasso regression classifier, which is a linear classifier with sparse weights. They could predict your behavior better than your friends could predict your behavior. Now, if you take that to another level, because of this weird psychological setup we have, where we are this entity that we're not fully consciously aware of. So we have our conscious selves and our subconscious selves, and we all have behaved in ways that we're ashamed about later or wouldn't like ourselves to behave. And there's this mismatch between who we think we are and who we actually are. So there's this sort of sense of like, I would never do that. And then actually people do those things all the time. When you're getting data from individuals at large scale, okay, you're basically able to exploit that, because you're able to exploit habitual behaviors that humans have that don't think they have in their moment when they're thinking how wonderful they are, but actually in practice that they keep doing. So I sometimes sort of think of this, it's a bit like very rapidly social media companies have worked out what the equivalent of the high fructose corn syrup diet is for us, right? So high fructose corn syrup, there's a whole phenomenon in nutrition where the amount of high fructose corn syrup in our food has been going up and up. And well, there's a theory that it has a very addictive quality because we would have experienced, as we evolved, fructose in trees, which would have come into fruit occasionally. And it would have been advantageous for us to consume large amounts of that fruit because its availability was small. And apparently also there's evidence that fructose goes very directly towards long-term fat storage, right? So, and we're excited, we get reward signals. So we're evolved to be excited about fructose, right? So it's no surprise now that lots of foods have lots of fructose in it. It's not necessarily healthy for us, and it leads to things like an obesity crisis and everything else. That's happened over like decades. What's going on with social media is they are very rapidly discovering the cognitive equivalent of high fructose corn syrup. And you can see whatever the cognitive equivalent of an obesity crisis is likely to follow. Now, how do you control for that? Well, the only way you control for that is with privacy legislation, bringing in legislation about what actions you can take on individuals' data, right? To the extent that they can sort of tailor the output towards you. I mean, already, I resist it already. Like you'll see, I think one of the lecture notes, I can't stand it. Like Towards Data Science has the 5 methods you'll need to know to be a data scientist or whatever else, or you won't believe what these 7 other Cambridge data scientists are working on now, or all these clickbait headlines that is driving like the blogosphere now and everything else, all because we're susceptible to clicking on those things. Now, personally, I see anything titled like that and I don't want to click on it now. So we build our own mechanisms ourselves, but that's the ones we can become conscious of. There are the things that we're not conscious of. So protecting your personal information, even fairly, things that don't seem that important, like the movies you like or the friends you have, actually becomes quite important in preserving your individuality against this machine that won't just look at it and understand who you are quite well, but will also be aiming to exploit it by selling you ads, right? The incentives of these companies are not aligned with your personal incentives. They're trying to get you to buy things that you didn't realize you wanted. So that's, it's fine. Like, this has happened for years, but it's just the scale at which it can now happen. And the effects that's having on things like we see in, we all get more extreme videos coming up because we get more attention to those. And the only way I think that we can deal with that personally, so the sort of thing I've worked on for that, is retaining control of that aspect of ourselves. So the final thing that I just wanted to mention, I won't go through the Data Science Africa work, which is, I'll just briefly say something about Data Science Africa, because somehow I've got my slides out of order. Well, I'll come back to that. So the mechanism that I've been thinking about and working on, and is now in some quite good government recommendations, is data governance mechanisms. So it's this one here. In particular, data trusts. So institutions that manage data on the behalf of individuals, right? So these personal data trusts. So this is an article I wrote in Guardian in 2016, which was proposing this. And the whole notion is that we're in this sort of area of data feudalism, where you have these people that manage your data on your behalf, and you have no say over that, how that's being managed. So the notion of a data trust, and the other data institutions that propose, are that you agree as a group to collate your data in one place, and then that data is managed on your behalf by people who pay more attention to you. So the equivalent of a government. Now, it's true that the government doesn't always represent our beliefs, but they are held accountable to us on some particular period of time. So the notion here is you create data institutions that are accountable to the members of those institutions, but these things just don't exist right today. Right, what we've got at the moment is that that's going on in terms of a business owns and controls that data. And it's actually quite hard to get that data out if you want to use it to fix a pandemic, right? So these are sort of really the big issues around there. And I guess the final one I'll just say briefly, when you look at marginalized groups, so I just really, the more I work on this area, the more I think it's problematic when people in one society or country decide what the solutions are for people in another society. And that is really causing, within globalization, that's causing massive problems. So the other thing that I've been working with, because I was lucky enough to have a postdoc who was from Kenya, and when he went back to Kenya, he set up Data Science Africa, which is now had all these meetings since it was set up in 2016, where you're doing data science education in locus. So that there's this wonderful phrase that Shira, this colleague of mine, has, that only the wearer of the shoe knows where it pinches. And so the point is that you want to equip communities with the skills to solve these problems themselves, and not be imposing these solutions on them from central. And my own experience of when you start doing that is you really start to understand the domain properly. Instead of this notion of we're isolated here and we're working for a company that wants to fix this problem, but we're not actually talking to the people who we're fixing the problem before. Now that all works when society is ordered and everything else, and we've worked out the mechanisms of society to deal with these challenges. But the fact is, when it comes to this all the phenomena we talked about in lecture 1, society is not oriented to deal with these challenges yet. So actually, by going right to the source of and talking to people who have those problems and learning from them to work to fix those problems, and training people to understand what we're working on here today is in many places possible. I think that's the sort of final way that you deal with marginalization. And I'll stop there because I meant to stop 5 minutes earlier, but I went on a bit too much. But questions, let me just stop the